Hello, hello. My name is Monique Josephine, and I am back with Hillbilly Elegy. This is our episode 5, I believe. We are in the middle of chapter 4. This is obviously for educational purposes. I do encourage, if you are enjoying this or if you like this story at all, to purchase it. I got it for like $11 from Target, so I do encourage you to get the book and read along with me. Also, other good news, I ordered a microphone so that my audio sounds better. I got a better light coming in, and I'm going to invest in a video editor so that my videos are better quality, because I listen to them and I'm like, ugh, when I make mistakes, it's hard to listen. So thank you for all of you who have bared with me, and let's jump right into it. AK Steel is the result of a 1989 merger between Armco Steel and Kawasaki, the same Japanese corporation that makes those small, high-powered motorcycles, crotch rockets we called them as kids. Most people still call it Armco for two reasons. The first is that, as Mamaw used to say, Armco built this effing town. She wasn't lying. Many of the city's best parks and facilities were bought with Armco dollars. Armco's people sat on the boards of many of the most important local organizations, and it helped to fund schools, and it employed thousands of Middletonians who, like my grandfather, earned a good wage despite the lack of formal education. Armco earned its reputation through careful design. Until the 1950s, writes Chad Berry in his book, Southern Migrants, Northern Exiles. The big four employers of the Miami Valley region, Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, Champion Paper and Fiber in Hamilton, Armco Steel in Middletown, and National Cash Register in Dayton had serene labor relations, partially because they hired family and friends of employees who were once migrants themselves. For example, Inland Container in Middleton had 220 Kentuckians on its payroll, 117 of whom were from Wolfe County alone. While labor relations no doubt declined by the 1980s, much of the goodwill built by Armco and similar companies remained. The other reason most still call it Armco is that Kawasaki was a Japanese company, and in a town full of World War II vets and their families. You'd have thought that General Tojo himself had decided to set up shop in Southwest Ohio when the merger was announced. The opposition was mostly a bunch of noise. Even Papa, who once promised he'd disown his children if they bought a Japanese car, stopped complaining a few days after they announced the merger. The truth is, he told me, that the Japanese are our friends now. If we end up fighting any other of those countries, it'll probably be that goddamn Chinese. The Kawasaki merger represents an inconvenient truth. Manufacturing in America was a tough business in the post-globalization world. If companies like Armco were going to survive, they would have to retool. Kawasaki gave Armco a chance, and Middletown's flagship company would not have survived without it. Growing up, my friends and I had no clue that the world had changed. Papa had retired a few years earlier, owned stock in Armco, and had a lucrative pension. Armco Park remained the nicest, most exclusive recreation spot in town, and access to the private park was a status symbol. It meant that your dad or grandpa was a man with a respected job. It never occurred to me that Armco wouldn't be around forever, funding scholarships, building parks, and throwing free concerts. Still, few of my friends had ambitions to work there. As small children, we had the same dreams the other kids did. We wanted to be astronauts or football player or action heroes. I wanted to be a professional puppy player with her. That would be very nice. If that were a job, I would be like, number one, baby. I got my puppy right here. Which at the time seemed entirely reasonable. By sixth grade, we wanted to be veterinarians, doctor, preachers, or businessmen, but not steel workers, even at Roosevelt Elementary, where thanks to Middletown geography, most people's parents lacked a college education. No one wanted to have a blue-collar career. It's promise of a respectable middle-class life. We never considered that we'd be lucky to land a job at Armco. We took Armco for granted. Many kids seem to feel that way today. A few years ago, I spoke with Jennifer McGuffey, a Middleton, Ohio school teacher who works with at-risk youth. A lot of students just don't understand what's out there, she told me, shaking her head. You have kids who plan on being baseball players but don't even play in the high school team because the coach is mean to them. Then you have those who aren't doing very well in school, and when you try to talk to them about what they're going to do, they talk about AK. Oh, I can get a job at AK. My uncle works there. It's like they can't make the connection between the situation in the town and the lack of jobs at AK. My initial reaction was, how could these kids not understand what the world was like? Didn't they notice their town changing before their very eyes? But then I realized we didn't, so why would they? For my grandparents, Armco was an economic savior. The engine that brought them from the hills of Kentucky into America's middle class. My grandfather loved the company. He knew every make and model of car built from Armco steel. Even after most American car companies transitioned away from steel-bodied cars, Papa would stop at a used car dealership whenever he saw an old Ford or Chevy. Armco made this steel, he'd tell me. It was one of the few times that he ever portrayed a sense of genuine pride. Despite that pride, he had no interest in my working there. Your generation will make its living with their minds, not their hands, he once told me. The only acceptable career at Armco was as an engineer, not as a laborer. In the weld shop, as an engineer, not as a laborer in the weld shop. A lot of other Middleton parents and grandparents must have felt similarly to them. The American dream requires more forward momentum. Manual labor was horrible work, but it was their generation's work. We had to do something different, to move up, to move on, and that required going to college. And yet, there was no sense of failing to achieve a higher education would bring shame or any other consequence. The message wasn't explicit. Teachers didn't tell us that we were too stupid or too poor to make it. Nevertheless, it was all around us, like the air we breathed. No one in our families had gone to college. Other friends and siblings were perfectly content to stay in Middletown, regardless of their career prospects. We knew no one at a prestigious out-of-state college, and everyone knew at least one young adult who was underemployed or didn't have a job at all. In Middletown, 20% of public high school freshmen won't make it to their graduation. Most won't graduate from college. Virtually no one will go to college out of state. Students don't expect much from themselves because the people around them don't do very much. Many parents go along with this phenomenon. I don't remember ever being scolded for generating a bad grade until Mama began to take an interest in my grades in high school. When my sister or I struggled in school, I'd overhear things like, well, maybe she's just not great at fractions, or JD's more of a number kid, so I wouldn't worry about his spelling. There was still a sense that those who make it are two varieties. First are the lucky. They come from wealthy families with connections, and their lives were set from the moment they were born. The second are a meritocratic. They were born with brains and couldn't fail if they tried. Because very few in Middletown fall into the former category, people assume that everyone who makes it is just really smart. To the average Middletonian, hard work doesn't matter as much as raw talent. It's not like parents and teachers never mention hard work, nor do they walk around loudly proclaiming that they expect their children to turn out poorly. These attitudes lurk below the surface, less in what people say than in how they act. One of our neighbors was a lifetime welfare recipient. But in between asking my grandmother to borrow her car or offering to trade food stamps for cash at a premium, she'd blather on about the importance of industriousness. So many people abuse the system, it's impossible for the hard-working people to get the help they need, she'd say. This is the construct she'd built in her head. Most of the beneficiaries of the system were extravagant moochers, but she, despite never having worked in her life, was an obvious exception. People talk about hard work all the time in places like Middleton. You can walk through a town where 30% of the young men work fewer than 20 hours a week and find not a single person aware of his own laziness. During the 2012 election cycle, the Public Religion Institute, a left-leaning think tank, published a report on working-class whites. It found, among other things, that working-class whites worked more hours than college-educated whites. But the idea that the average working-class white works more hours is demonstrably false. The Public Religion Institute based its results on surveys. Essentially, they just called around and asked people what they thought. The only thing that report proves is that many folks talk about working more than they actually work. Of course, the reason poor people aren't working as much as others are complicated, and it's too easy to blame the problem on laziness. For many, part-time work is all they have access to, because the Armcos of the world are going out of business and their skill sets don't fit in well in the modern economy. But whatever the reason, the rhetoric of hard work conflicts with the reality on the ground. The kids in Middleton absorb that conflict and struggle with it. In this, as in so much else, the Scots-Irish migrants resemble their kin back in the holler. In an HBO documentary about Eastern Kentucky Hill people, the patriarch of a large Appalachian family introduces himself by drawing strict lines between work acceptable for men and work acceptable for women. While it's obvious what he considers women work, it's not all that clear what work, if any, is acceptable for him. Apparently not paid employment, since the man has never worked a paying job in his life. Ultimately, the verdict of his own son is damning. Daddy says he's worked in his life. Only thing Daddy's worked is his goddamn ass. Why not be straight about it, Pa? Daddy was an alcoholic. He would stay drunk. He didn't bring food home. Mommy supported her youngins. If it hadn't been for Mommy, we'd have been dead. Alongside these conflicting norms about the value of blue-collar work exists a massive ignorance about how to achieve white-collar work. We didn't know that all across the country and even in our hometowns, other kids had already started a competition to get ahead in life. During the first grade, we played a game every morning. The teacher would announce the number of the day, and we'd go person by person and announce a math equation that produced the number. So if the number of the day was 4, you could announce 2 plus 2 and claim a prize, usually a small piece of candy. One day, the number was 30. The students in front of me went through the easy answers. 29 plus 1, 28 plus 2, 15 plus 15. I was better than that. I was going to blow the teacher away. When my turn came, I proudly announced 50 minus 20. The teacher gushed, and I received 2 pieces of candy for my foray in subtraction, a skill we'd learned only days before. A few moments later, while I beamed over my brilliance, another student announced 10 times 3. I had no idea what that even meant. Times? Who was this guy? The teacher was even more impressed at my competitor. Triumphantly, he collected not 2, but 3 pieces of candy. The teacher spoke briefly of multiplication and asked if anyone else knew such a thing existed. None of us raised a hand. For my part, I was crushed. I returned home and burst into tears. I was certain my ignorance was rooted in some failure of character. I felt stupid. It wasn't my fault that until that day I had never heard the word multiplication. It wasn't something I'd learned in school, and my family didn't sit around and work on math problems. But to the little kid who wanted to do well in school, it was a crushing defeat. In my immature brain, I didn't understand the difference between intelligence and knowledge, so I assumed that I was an idiot. I may not have known multiplication that day, but when I came home, I told Papa about my heartbreak. He turned it into triumph. I learned multiplication and division before dinner. And for 2 years after that, my grandfather and I would practice increasingly complex math problems once a week with an ice cream reward for a solid performance. I would beat myself up when I didn't understand a concept and storm off in defeat. But after I'd pout for a few minutes, Papa was always ready to go again. Mom was never much of a math person, but she took me to the public library before I could read, got me a library card, showed me how to use it, and always made sure I had access to kids' books back at home. In other words, despite all of the environmental pressures from my neighborhood and community, I received a different message at home, and that just might have saved me. Chapter 5. I assume I'm not alone in having few memories from before I was 6 or 7. I know that I was 4 when I climbed up on top of a dining room table in our small apartment and announced that I was the Incredible Hulk and dove headfirst into the wall to prove it. To prove I was stronger than any building. I was wrong. I remember being smuggled into the hospital to see Uncle T-Berry. I remember sitting on Mama Blanton's lap as she read Bible stories aloud before the sun came up. I remember stroking the whiskers on her chin and wondering whether God gave all old women facial hair. I remember explaining to Miss Hydrone in the holler that my name was JD, like J.D. I remember watching Joe Montana lead a TD winning drive in the Super Bowl against the hometown Bengals. And I remember the early September day in kindergarten when Mom and Lindsay picked me up from school and told me that I'd never see my dad again. He was giving me up for adoption, they said. It was the saddest I had ever felt. My father, Don Bowman, was Mom's second husband. Mom and Dad married in 1983 and split up by the time I started walking. Mom remarried a couple years after the divorce. Dad gave me up for adoption when I was 6. After the adoption, he became kind of a phantom for the next 6 years. I had few memories of a life with him. I knew that he loved Kentucky, its beautiful mountains, and its rolling green horse country. He drank RC Cola and had a clear Southern accent. He drank, but he stopped after he converted to Pentecostal Christianity. I always felt love when I spent time with him, which is why I found it so shocking that he didn't want me anymore. As Mom and Mama told me, he had a new wife with 2 small children, and I had been replaced. Ugh, could you imagine telling a little kid they'd been replaced? Bob Hamill, my stepdad and eventual adoptive father, was a good guy in that he treated Lindsay and me kindly. Mama didn't care for him much. He's a toothless fucking retard, she'd tell Mom. I suspect for reasons of class and culture, Mama had done everything in her power to be better than the circumstances of her birth. Though she was hardly rich, she wanted her kids to get an education, obtain white-collar work, marry well-groomed middle-class folks, people, in other words, who were nothing like Mama and Papa. Bob, however, was a walking hillbilly stereotype. He had little relationship with his own father and had learned the lesson of his own childhood well. He had 2 kids whom he barely saw, though they lived in Hamilton, a town 10 miles south of Middleton. Half of his teeth had rotted out, and the other half were black, brown, and misshapen. And presumably the consequence of a lifetime of Mountain Dew consumption and presumably some missed dental checkups. He was a high school dropout who drove a truck for a living. We'd all eventually learn that there was much to dislike about Bob. But what drove Mama's initial dislike were the parts of him that most resembled her. Mama apparently understood what would take me another 20 years to learn. That social class in America isn't just about money. And her desire that her children do better than she had done extended past their education and employment and into the relationships that they formed. When it came to spouses for her kids and parents for her grandkids, Mama felt, whether she knew it consciously, that he wasn't good enough. Mama felt, whether she knew it consciously, that she wasn't good enough. When Bob became my legal father, Mom changed my name from James Donald Bowman to James David Hamill. Until then, I had borne my father's first name as my middle name, and Mom used the adoption to erase any memory of his existence. She kept the D to preserve what had by then become a universal nickname, JD. Mom told me that I was now named after Uncle David, Mama's older pot-smoking brother. This seemed a bit of a stretch, even when I was 6. Any old D name would have done, so long as it wasn't Donald. Our new life with Bob had superficial family sitcom feel to it. Mom and Bob's marriage seemed happy. We were so close. Sorry. Mom and Bob's marriage seemed happy. They bought a house a few blocks away from Mama. We were so close that if the bathrooms were occupied or if I felt like a snack, I'd just walk over to Mama's. Mom had recently acquired her nursing license, and Bob made a great salary. So we had plenty of money. With our gun-toting, cigarette-smoking Mama up the street and new legal father, we were an odd family, but a happy one. My life assumed a predictable cadence. I'd go to school, come home, eat dinner. I visited Mama and Papa nearly every day. Papa would sit on the porch to smoke, and I'd sit out there with him and listen to him grumble about politics or the Steelworkers Union. When I learned to read, Mom bought me my first chapter book, Space Brat, and heaped into praise me for finishing it quickly. I love to read, and I love to work on math problems with Papa, and I love the way that Mom seemed to delight in everything I did. Mom and I bonded over things, especially our favorite sport, football. I read every word I could about Joe Montana, the greatest quarterback of all time. Watched every game and wrote fan mail to the 49ers and later the Chiefs, Montana's two teams. Mom checked out books on football strategy from the public library, and we built little models of the field with construction paper and loose change. Pennies for the defense, nickels and dimes for the offense. Mom didn't want me to understand only the rules of football. She wanted me to understand the strategy. We practiced on our construction paper football field, going over the various contingencies. What happened if a particular lineman, a shiny nickel, missed his block? What could the quarterback, a dime, do if no receiver, another dime, was open? We didn't have chess, but we did have football. More than anyone else in my family, Mom wanted us to be exposed to people from all walks of life. Her friend Scott was a kind old gay man who she later told me died unexpectedly. She made me watch a movie about Ryan White, a boy not that much older than I was, who contracted HIV through a blood transfusion and had to start a legal fight to return to school. Every time I complained about school, Mom reminded me of Ryan White and spoke about what a blessing it was to get an education. She was so overcome by White's story that she had a handwritten letter to his mother after he died in 1990. Mom believed deeply in the promise of education. She was the valedictorian of her high school class, but never made it to college because Lindsay was born weeks after Mom graduated from high school. But she did return to a local community college and earn an associate's degree in nursing. I was probably like 7 or 8 when she started working full-time as a nurse. And I like to think that I had contributed in some small way. I helped her study by crawling all over her, and I let her practice drawing my blood on my youthful veins. Sometimes Mom's devotion to education arguably went a little too far. During my 3rd grade science fair project, Mom helped at every stage, from planning the project to assisting with lab notes to assembling the presentation. The night before everything was due, the project looked precisely how it deserved to look. Like the work of a 3rd grader who had slacked off a bit. I went to bed expecting to wake up the next morning, give my mediocre presentation, and call it a day. The science fair was a competition, and I even thought that with a little salesmanship, I could advance to the next round. But in the morning, I discovered that Mom had revamped the entire presentation. It looked like a scientist and a professional artist had joined forces to create it. Though the judges were blown away when they began to ask questions that I couldn't answer, but that the maker of the collage would have known, they realized something didn't fit. I didn't make it to the final round of the competition. What that incident taught me, besides the fact that I needed to do my own work, was that Mom cared deeply about the enterprises of the mind. Nothing brought her greater joy than when I finished a book or asked for another. Mom was, everyone told me, the smartest person they knew. And I believed it. She was definitely the smartest person I knew. In the Southwest Ohio of my youth, we learned to value loyalty, honor, and toughness. I earned my first bloody nose at 5 and my first black eye at 6. Each of these fights began after someone insulted my mother. Mother jokes were never allowed, and grandmother jokes earned the harshest punishment that my little fists could administer. Mama and Papa ensured that I knew the basic rules of fighting. You never start a fight. You always end a fight if someone else starts it. And even though you never start a fight, it's maybe okay to start one if a man insults your family. The last rule was unspoken but clear. Lindsay had a boyfriend named Derek, maybe her first boyfriend, who broke up with her after a few days. She was heartbroken as only 13-year-olds can be. So I decided to confront Derek when I saw him walking past our house one day. He had 5 years and about 35 pounds on me, but I came at him twice. He pushed me down easily. The third time I came at him, he'd had enough and proceeded to pound the shit out of me. I ran to Mama's house for some first aid, crying, and a little bloody. She just smiled at me. You did good, honey. You did real good. In fighting, as with many things, Mama taught me through experience. She never laid a hand on me punitively. She was anti-spanking in a way that must have come from her own bad experiences. But when I asked her what it felt like to be punched in the head, she showed me. A swift blow delivered by the meteor of her hand directly on my cheek. That didn't feel so bad, did it? And the answer was no. Getting hit in the face wasn't nearly as terrible as I'd imagined. This was one of her most important rules of fighting. Unless someone really knows how to hit, a punch in the face is no big deal. Better to take a blow to the face than to miss an opportunity to deliver your own. Her second tip was to stand sideways with your left shoulder facing your opponent and your hands raised because you're a much smaller target that way. Her third rule was to punch with your whole body, especially your hips. Very few people, Mama told me, appreciate how unimportant your fist is when it comes to hitting someone. Despite her admonition not to start fights, our unspoken honor code made it easy to convince someone else to start a fight for you. If you really wanted to get into it with someone, all you needed to do was insult his mom. No amount of self-control could withstand a well-played maternal criticism. Your mom's so fat her ass is its own zip code. Your mom's such a hillbilly that her false teeth have cavities. Or a simple, yo mama. These were fighting words, whether you wanted them to be or not. To shirk from evading a string of insults was to lose your honor, your dignity, or even your friend. It was to go home, be afraid, tell your family you had disgraced them. I didn't know why, but after a few years, Mama's views evolved on fighting. I was in the third grade, had just lost a race, and felt there was only one way to adequately deal with the taunting victor. Mama, lurking nearby, intervened in what was certain to be another schoolyard cage match. She sternly asked whether I had forgotten her lesson that the only just fights are defensive. I didn't know what to say. She had endorsed the unstated rule of honor fighting only a few years earlier. One time I got in a fight and you told me that I did good, I told her. She said, well then, I was wrong. You shouldn't fight unless you have to. Now, that made an impression. Mama never admitted mistakes. The next year, I noticed that a class bully had taken a particular interest in a specific victim, an odd kid I rarely spoke to. Thanks to many prior exploits, I was largely immune to bullying, and like most kids, was usually content to avoid the bully's attention. One day, though, he said something about his victim that I overheard and felt a strong urge to stick up for the poor kid. There was something pathetic about the target, who seemed especially wounded by the bully's treatment. When I spoke to Mama after school that day, I broke down in tears. I felt incredibly guilty that I hadn't had the courage to speak up for this poor kid, that I had just sat there and listened to someone else make his life a living hell. She asked whether I had spoken to the teacher about it, and I assured her that I did. That bitch ought to be put in jail for sitting there and not doing anything. And then she said something that I will never forget. Sometimes, honey, you have to fight, even when you're not defending yourself. Sometimes it's just the right thing to do. Tomorrow you need to stand up for that boy. And if you have to stand up for yourself, then do that too. She taught me a move, a swift, hard, make sure to turn your hips, punch right in the gut. If he starts in on you, make sure to punch him right in the belly button. The next day at school, I felt nervous, and I hoped that the bully would take a day off. But in the predictable chaos as the class lined up for lunch, the bully, his name was Chris, asked my little charge whether he planned on crying that day. Shut up, I said. Just leave him alone. Chris approached me, punched me, and asked what I planned to do about it. Chris approached me, pushed me, and asked what I planned to do about it. I walked right up to him, pivoted my right hip, and sucker punched him right in the stomach. He immediately and terrifyingly dropped to his knees, seemingly unable to breathe. By the time I realized that I'd already injured him, he was alternately coughing and trying to catch his breath. He even spit up a small amount of blood. Chris went to the school nurse, and after I confirmed that I hadn't killed him and would avoid the police, my thoughts immediately turned to the school justice system, whether I'd be suspended or expelled and for how long. While the other kids played at recess and Chris recovered with the nurse, the teacher brought me into the classroom. This is so sweet. I love teachers like this. There's just certain people like Mama telling them, sometimes you have to fight, even if you're not defending yourself, because it's the right thing to do. And those are the kind of things I feel like we resist more as adults. Defending people, getting involved in things we don't want to, which I understand, it's a lot. But it's those kind of values that I feel like we're losing now. Okay, so while the other kids played at recess and Chris recovered with the nurse, the teacher brought me into the classroom. I thought she was going to tell me that she'd called my parents and that I'd be kicked out of school. But instead, she gave me a lecture about fighting and made me practice my handwriting instead of playing outside. I detected hint of approval from the teacher. And I sometimes wonder whether there were school politics at work and her inability to appropriately discipline the class bully. At any rate, Mama found out about the fight directly from me and praised me for doing something really good. It was the last time I ever got in a fist fight. While I recognize that things weren't perfect, I also recognize that our family shared a lot with most of the other families. While I recognize that things weren't perfect, I also recognize that our family shared a lot with most of the families I saw around me. Yes, my parents fought intensely, but so did everyone else's. Yes, my grandparents played a big role in my life, as Mom and Bob did, but that was the norm in hillbilly families. We didn't live a peaceful life in a small nuclear family. We lived a chaotic life in big groups of aunts, uncles, grandparents, and cousins. This was the life I'd been given, and I was a pretty happy kid. When I was about 9 years old, things began to unravel at home. Tired of Papa's constant presence and Mama's interference, Mom and Bob decided to move to Primble County, a sparsely populated part of Ohio farm country, approximately 35 miles from Middleton. Even as a boy, I knew this was the very worst thing that could happen to me. Mama and Papa were my best friends. They helped me with my homework. They spoiled me with treats when I behaved correctly or finished a difficult school assignment. They were also the gatekeepers. They were the scariest people I knew. Old hillbillies who carried loaded guns in their coat pockets and under their car seats, no matter the occasion. They kept the monsters at bay. Bob was Mom's third husband, but the third time was not the charm. By the time we moved to Pramble County, Mom and Bob had already begun to fight, and many of those fights would keep me up well past my bedtime. They said things friends and family should never say to each other. "Fuck you. Go back to your trailer park," Mom sometimes told Bob, a reference to his life before they were married. Sometimes Mom would take us to a local motel where we'd hide out for a few days until Mama or Papa convinced Mom to face her domestic problems. Mom had a lot of Mama's fire, which meant that she never allowed herself to become a victim during domestic disputes. It also meant that she normally escalated normal disagreements beyond where they should go. During one of my second grade football games, a tall, overweight mother muttered about why I had been given the ball on the previous play. Mom, a bleacher row behind the woman, overheard the comment and told her that I'd been given the ball because, unlike her child, I wasn't a fat piece of shit who'd been raised by a fat piece of shit mother. By the time I observed the commotion on the sidelines, Bob was ripping Mom away with the woman's hair still clenched in her hands. After the game, I asked Mom what happened, and she replied, "Only, no one criticizes my boy." I beamed with pride. In Pramble County, with Mama and Papa over 45 minutes away, the fights turned into screaming matches. Often the subject was money. Though it made little sense for a rural Ohio family with a combined income of over $100,000 to struggle with money. But fight they did because they bought things they didn't need. New cars, new trucks, a swimming pool. By the time their short marriage fell apart, they were tens of thousands of dollars in debt with nothing to show for it. Finances were the least of our problems. Mom and Bob had never been violent with each other, but that slowly started to change. I awoke one night to the sound of breaking glass. Mom had lobbed plates at Bob and ran downstairs to see what was up. He was holding her against the kitchen counter, and she was flailing and biting him. When she dropped to the ground, I ran to her lap. When Bob moved closer, I stood up and punched him in the face. He reared back to return the blow, I figured. I collapsed on the ground with my arms over my head in anticipation. The blow never came. Bob never was physically abusive, and my intervention somehow ended the fight. He walked over to the couch and sat down silently, staring at the wall. Mom and I meekly walked upstairs to bed. Mom and Bob's problems were my first introduction to marital conflict resolution. Here were the takeaways. Never speak at a reasonable volume when screaming. Here were the takeaways. Never speak at a reasonable volume when screaming will do. If the fight gets a little too intense, it's okay to slap and punch, so long as the man doesn't hit first. Always express your feelings in a way that's insulting and hurtful to your partner. If all else fails, take the kids and the dog to a local motel and don't tell your spouse where to find you. If he or she knows where the children are, he or she won't worry as much, and your departure won't be as effective. I began to do poorly in school. Many nights, I'd lie in bed unable to sleep because of the noise and the furniture rocking. Heavy stomping, yelling, sometimes glass shattering. The next morning, I'd wake up tired and depressed, meandering through the school day, thinking constantly about what awaited me at home. I just wanted to retreat to a place where I could sit in silence. I couldn't tell anyone what was going on, as that was far too embarrassing. And though I hated school, I hated home more. When the teacher announced that we had only a few minutes to clear out our desks before the bell rang, my heart sank. I'd stare at the clock as if it were a ticking time bomb. Not even Mama understood how terrible things had become. My slipping grades were the first indication. Not every day was like that, of course, but even when the house was ostensibly peaceful, our lives were so charged that I was constantly on guard. Mom and Bob never smiled at each other or said nice things to Lindsay and me anymore. You never knew when the wrong word would turn a quiet dinner into a terrible fight, or when a minor childhood transgression would send a plate or book flying across the room. It was like we were living among landmines. One wrong step, kaboom. Up to that point in my life, I was a perfectly fit and healthy child. I exercised constantly, and though I didn't exactly watch what I ate, I didn't have to. But I began to put on weight, and I was positively chubby by the time I started 5th grade. I often felt sick and would complain of severe stomach aches to the school nurse. Though I didn't realize it at the time, the trauma at home was clearly affecting my health. Elementary students may show signs of distress through stomach complaints such as stomach aches, headaches, and pains. Reads one resource for school administrators who deal with children who suffer from trauma at home. These students may have a change in behavior, such as increased irritability, aggression, and anger. Their behaviors may be inconsistent. These students may show a change in school performance and have impaired attention and concentration and more school absences. I just thought I was constipated or that I really hated my new hometown. Bob and Mom weren't that abnormal. It would be tough to chronicle all the outbursts and screaming matches I witnessed that had nothing to do with my family. My neighbor friend and I would play in his backyard until we heard screaming from his parents, and then we'd run into an alley and hide. Papa's neighbors would yell so loudly that we could hear it from inside his house. And it was so common, he'd always say, "God damn it, there they go again." I once saw a young couple's argument at the local Chinese buffet. It escalated into a symphony of curse words and insults. Mama and I used to open the windows on one side of her house so we could hear the substance of the explosive fights between her neighbor Patty and Patty's boyfriend. Seeing people insult, scream, and sometimes physically fight was just part of our life. After a while, you didn't even notice it. I always thought it was how adults spoke to one another. When Lori married Dan, I learned of at least one exception. Mama told me that Dan and Aunt Wee never screamed at each other because Dan was different. "He's a saint," she'd say. As we got to know Dan's entire family, I realized that they were just nicer to each other. They didn't yell at each other in public. I got the distinct impression that they didn't yell at each other much in private either. I thought they were frauds. Aunt Wee saw it differently. I just assumed they were really weird. I knew they were genuine. I just figured they were genuinely odd. The never-ending conflict took its toll. Even thinking about it today makes me nervous. My heart begins to race. My stomach leaps into my throat. When I was very young, all I wanted to do was get away from it, to hide from the fighting, go to Mama's, or disappear. I couldn't hide from it because it was all around me. Over time, I started to like the drama. Instead of hiding from it, I'd run downstairs or put my ear to the wall to get a better listen. My heart would still race, but in an anticipatory way, like it did when I was about to score in a baseball game. Even the fight that went too far, when I thought Bob was about to hit me, was less about the brave kid who intervened and more about the spectator who got a little close to the action. This thing that I hated, I had become sort of a drug. One day I came home from school to see Mama's car in the driveway. It was an ominous sign. She's never made an unannounced visit to our Primble County home. She made an exception on this day because Mom was in the hospital, the result of a failed suicide attempt. For all the things I saw happening in the world around me, my 11-year-old eyes missed so much. In her work at the Middleton Hospital, Mom had met and fallen in love with a local fireman and begun a years-long affair. That morning, Bob had confronted her about the affair and demanded a divorce. Mom had sped off in her brand new minivan and intentionally crashed it into a pole. That's what she said, at least. Mama had her own theory, that Mom had tried to distract attention from her cheating and financial problems. As Mama said, who tries to kill themselves by crashing a fucking car? If she wanted to kill herself, I've got plenty of guns. Lindsay and I largely bought Mama's view of things, and we felt relief more than anything that Mom hadn't really hurt herself, and that Mom's attempted suicide would be the end of our Primble County experiment. She spent only a couple of days in the hospital. Within a month, we moved back to Middleton, 1 block closer to Mama than we'd been before, with one less man in tow. Despite the return to a familiar home, Mom's behavior grew erratic. She was more roommate than parent. And of the 3 of us, Mom, Lindsay, and me, Mom was the roommate most prone to hard living. I'd go to bed only to wake up around midnight when Lindsay got home from doing whatever teenagers do. I'd wake up again at 2 or 3 in the morning when Mom got home. She had new friends, most of them younger without kids, and she cycled through boyfriends, switching partners every few months. It was so bad that my best friend at the time commented on her flavors of the month. I'd grown accustomed to a certain amount of instability, but it was of a familiar type. There would be fighting or running away from fights when things got rocky. Mom would explode on us or even slap or pinch us. I didn't like it, who would? But this new behavior was just strange. Though Mom had been many things, she hadn't been a partier. When we moved back to Middleton, that changed. With partying came alcohol, and with alcohol came abuse and even more bizarre behavior. One day when I was about 12, Mom said something that I don't remember now, but I recall running out the door without my shoes and going to Mama's house. For 2 days, I refused to speak to or even see my mother. Papa worried about the disintegrating relationship between his daughter and her son. He begged me to see her. So I listened to the apology that I'd heard a million times. Before, Mom was always good at apologies. Maybe she had to be. If she hadn't said sorry, then Lindsay and I never would have spoken to her. But I think she really meant it. Deep down, she always felt guilty about the things that happened, and she probably even believed that. As promised, they'd never happen again. They always did, though. This time was no different. Mom was extra apologetic because her sin was extra bad. So her penance was extra good. She promised to take me to the mall and buy football cards. Football cards were my kryptonite, so I agreed to join her. It was probably the biggest mistake of my life. We got on the highway, and I said something that ignited her temper. So she sped up to what seemed like 100 miles per hour and told me that she was going to crash the car and kill us both. I jumped into the back seat, thinking that if I could use 2 seat belts at once, I'd be more likely to survive the impact. This infuriated her more, so she pulled over to beat the shit out of me. When she did, I leaped out of the car and ran for my life. We were in a rural part of the state, and I had ran through a large field of grass, the tall blades slapping my ankles as I sped away. I happened upon a small house with an above-ground pool. The owner, an overweight woman the same age as Mom, was floating on her back, enjoying the nice June weather. "You have to call my mama," I screamed. "Please help me. My mom is trying to kill me." The woman clambered out of the pool as I looked around fearfully, terrified of any sign of my mother. We went inside. I called Mama and repeated the woman's address. "Please hurry up," I told her. "Mom's gonna find me." Mom did find me. She must have seen where I ran from the highway. Mom did find me. She must have seen where I ran from the highway. She banged on the door and demanded that I come out. I begged the owner not to open the door. So she locked the doors and promised Mom that her 2 dogs, each no bigger than a medium-sized cat, would attack her if she tried to enter. Eventually, Mom broke down the woman's door and dragged me out as I screamed and clutched for anything. The screen door, the guardrails on the steps, the grass on the ground. The woman stood there and watched, and I hated her for doing nothing. But she had in fact done something. In the minutes between my call to Mama and Mom's arrival, the woman had apparently dialed 911. So as Mom dragged me to her car, 2 police cruisers pulled up. The cops who got out put Mom in handcuffs. She did not go quietly. They wrestled her into the back of a cruiser, and then she was gone. The second cop put me in the back of his cruiser as we waited for Mama to arrive. I've never felt so lonely, watching that cop interview the homeowners. Still, in her soaking wet bathing suit, flanked by 2 pint-sized guard dogs, unable to open the cruiser door from the inside, and unsure when I could expect Mama's arrival. I had begun to daydream when the car doors swung open and Lindsay crawled into the cruiser with me. She clutched me to her chest so tightly that I couldn't breathe. We didn't cry. We said nothing. I just sat there, being squeezed to death and feeling like all was right with the world. When we got out of the car, Mama and Papa hugged me and asked if I was okay. Mama spun me around to inspect me. Papa spoke with the police officer about where to find his incarcerated daughter. Lindsay never let me out of her sight. It had been the scariest day of my life, but the hard part was over. When we got home, none of us could talk. Mama wore a silent, terrifying anger. I hoped that she would calm down before Mom got out of jail. I was exhausted and wanted only to lie on the couch and watch TV. Lindsay went upstairs and took a nap. Papa collected a food order for Wendy's. On his way out the front door, he stopped and stood over me on the couch. Mama had left the room temporarily. Papa placed his hand on my forehead and began to sob. I was so afraid that I didn't even look at his face. I had never heard of him crying, never seen him cry, and assumed that he was so tough that he hadn't even cried as a baby. He held that pose for a little while until we both heard Mama approaching the living room. At that point, he collected himself, wiped his eyes, and left. Neither of us ever spoke of that moment. Mom was released from jail on bond and prosecuted for domestic violence misdemeanor. The case depended entirely on me. Yet, during the hearing, when asked if Mom had ever threatened me, I said no. The reason was simple. My grandparents were paying a lot of money for the town's highest-powered lawyer. They were furious with my mother, but they didn't want their daughter in jail either. The lawyer never explicitly encouraged dishonesty, but he did make it clear that what I said would either increase or decrease the odds that Mom spent additional time in prison. "You don't want your mom to go to jail, do you?" he asked. So I lied, with the express understanding that even though Mom would have her liberty, I could live with my grandparents whenever I wished. Mom would officially retain custody, but from that day forward, I lived in her house only when I chose to. And Mama told me that if Mom had a problem with the arrangement, she could talk to the barrel of Mama's gun. This was hillbilly justice, and it didn't fail me. Gosh, it's so moving. I remember sitting in that busy courtroom with half a dozen other families all around, thinking they looked just like us. The moms and dads and grandparents didn't wear suits like the lawyers and the judge. They wore sweatpants and stretchy pants and t-shirts. Their hair was a bit frizzy, and it was the first time I noticed TV accents, the neutral accent that so many news anchors had. The social workers and the judge and the lawyers all had TV accents. None of us did. The people who ran the courthouse were different from us. The people subject to it were not. Identity is an odd thing, and I didn't understand at that time why I felt such kinship with those strangers. A few months later, during my first trip to California, I began to understand. Uncle Jimmy flew Lindsay and me to his home in Napa, California. Knowing that I'd be visiting him, I told every person I could that I was headed to California in the summer, and what was more, flying for the first time. The main reaction was disbelief that my uncle had enough money to fly two people, neither of whom were his children, out to California. It is a testament to the class consciousness of my youth, and that my friends' thought drifted first to the cost of an airplane flight. For my part, I was overjoyed to travel west and visit Uncle Jimmy, a man I'd idolized on par with my great uncles, the Blanton men. Despite the early departure, I didn't sleep a wink on the 6-hour flight from Cincinnati to San Francisco. Everything was just too exciting. The way the earth shrank during takeoff, the look of the clouds from close up, the scope and size of the sky, and the way the mountains looked from the stratosphere. The flight attendant took notice, and by the time we hit Colorado, I was making regular visits to the cockpit. This was before 9/11, where the pilot gave me brief lessons in flying an airplane and updated me on our progress. Oh, that had to be so sweet. The adventure had just begun. I had traveled out of state before. I had joined my grandparents on road trips to South Carolina and Texas, and I visited Kentucky regularly. On those trips, I rarely spoke to anyone except for family. I never noticed anything at all different. Napa was like a different country in California. Every day included a new adventure with my teenage cousins and their friends. During one trip, we went to the Castro district of San Francisco, so that, in words of my older cousins, Rachel and I could learn that gay people weren't out to molest me. Another day, we visited a winery. On yet another day, we helped at my cousin Nate's high school football practice. It was all very exciting. Everyone I met, though, I sounded like I was from Kentucky. It was very exciting. Everyone I met thought I sounded like I was from Kentucky. Of course, I kind of was from Kentucky. And I loved that people thought that I had a funny accent. That said, it became clear to me that California really was something else. I'd visited Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Columbus, Lexington. I'd spent a considerable amount of time in South Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, even Arkansas. So why was California so different? The answer I'd learned was the same hillbilly highway that brought Mama and Papa from eastern Kentucky to southwestern Ohio. Despite the topographical difference and the different regional economies of the South and the industrial Midwest, my travels had been confined largely to places where the people looked and acted like my family. We ate the same foods, watched the same sports, and practiced the same religion. That's why I felt so much kinship with those people at the courthouse. They were hillbilly transplants in one way or another, just like me. All right, that's where I'm going to leave it today. This is the longest one I've done yet. And out of this section, what really stood out to me is the way that first JD got in his fist fights. How I was born in 89, and I do remember the the unspoken rule that, yes, if somebody hit you first, you could fight and not get in trouble. My dad would always say not to let anybody hit me. Also, if my brothers didn't defend me, they would get their asses whooped. And I'm the youngest of 6, so they had a lot of responsibility for anything that happened to me as the youngest. Also, the really scary experience of his stepdad and mom fighting. And I think it really does say a lot about his stepdad, after being punched in the face by little JD expecting to get, thumped in the head or punched in the head. And he didn't do it, and I think that might be what his mom saw in him. This hillbilly guy that Mama and Papa didn't approve of. But he did obviously have, a kind heart, and probably just didn't get the preparation the same as Bev. Growing up the way they did, they just weren't prepared for the relationship that they were in. And then, of course, his mom scaring him to death in the car. Oh, that is so scary. I like the fact that, that when JD was waiting in the back of the cruiser and his sister came and just hugged him so tight, they didn't cry, but he knew that he was okay. And that they arrived so quickly. I'm sure it wasn't only minutes before his family arrived, and even though they were incredibly disappointed in their daughter for the way that she behaved with her son, they still supported her. And I always try to explain the difference between my family and my husband's family. They, like, if someone were in his family having an affair with a married person or something like that, they would never accept that. They would tell the husband or wife that someone in their family was having a relationship with their wife or their husband. Like, they are not okay with keeping secrets and things like that, which I feel like is normal. In my family, we have been taught, and it has been drilled into us, you do not snitch on your siblings. You always have their back. And that's kind of like what I've noticed differently. Like, we always joke, like, what I always joke about is, like, if I need to hide a body, I'll call my family, and no one will ever hear about it. But my husband's family is different. Their love is more traditional. It's not as dysfunctional. It's not overwhelming or underwhelming like it is being around my family. So it's just like an interesting thing that I recognize, that I feel like I can relate to JD in that sense. And that loyalty that is brought up, just drilled into our heads. Like, family is everything. And don't let anybody come between you. His grandparents were going to get their daughter out of jail, even though they were so disappointed. So yeah, that ends it here, and we will start next on chapter 6. I look forward to it. Thank you so much for tuning in, and ciao for now.